Good evening. My name is Johanna Koljonen, and you are watching Crosstalks, a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, Stockholm University and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. Please do join us in discussing today's topics on Twitter, where our handle is Crosstalks TV and our hashtag is Crosstalks. We humans have always wanted to make ourselves better, faster, stronger, and smarter. And we have. Just not quite like this. With implants, nanotechnology, artificial body parts, and smart drugs, the human physiology can be enhanced far beyond our current limitations. But is this really something we should pursue? Can we do it responsibly? Here to discuss the possibilities and possible dangers of human enhancement are Karim Jebari, Ph.D. in analytic philosophy, KTH Royal Institute of Technology and postdoc at the Institute for Future Studies, Nilsson, lecturer and researcher, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, and Gustav Nilsonne, MD, Ph.D. researcher in cognitive neuroscience at Stockholm University. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you.
So let's start with the broadest possible question. Okay, I am a comic book nut. I've grown up on superheroes. I love superhero movies. And I am perhaps what you would describe as an average, relatively healthy person. If we were to try to turn me into a superhero, or at least move in that direction, what would be technically and medically possible today in terms of enhancing my abilities? Go.
Well, it depends what you mean by enhancing you, because in a sense, you can already fly with an airplane. And you can also live for a very long time with vaccines and antibiotics. So in a sense, we already have the superhero abilities that the ancient Greeks thought that the gods might have. But of course, this is not what we really mean when we say that we can do these things, because they are not integrated in our bodies. So if you mean to ask what could be done without large artifacts such as airplanes, then I think that that the superhero visions are not quite here yet. Even though, of course, when it comes to immunity to diseases, we have quite astonishing capabilities.
How would the other two approach this? Could you make if you are allowed to use small artifacts, what can I do then?
Well, it depends on what you mean by small, and it also, I think it depends on how much of your original body would you actually like to keep. Because what we could do is we could cut off your original hands and we could replace them with artificial hands that could be a bit stronger, a bit more sensitive, a bit faster than your original hands. Or we could remove your legs and we could put the artificial legs and so on, and we can try to get you better eyes or better ears or whichever. But there are still technological parts. They are not the original Johanna anymore. So would that actually be something that you would be interested in if we make that kind of surgery on you?
That's a very good question. I'm actually not quite sure what the answer to that is. Immediately,
yes. One answer? I believe that if we have a discussion of what constitutes part of myself, what can I do, in contrast to what I can do with an artifact, I think it has to do, at least in our culture, with our mental representation of ourselves. So when I imagine myself, I normally imagine myself dressed with textiles. I don't imagine myself without them. So when I think of my capabilities, I also include the clothes I have in my internal representation. And I think this is also the case when people describe what they can do or can't do with or without their prostheses.
And possibly, I'm realizing just now, our cell phones as well are becoming more and more internalized into that image of what belongs to our body and that kind of a thing. That's why we have that reflex. If you drop your computer, you want to put your foot under it to protect it, which is not a very good idea, it turns out. But it's interesting, this question already got us into some very sort of heavy questions, and this is what we're going to be probing in this hour. Karim, you're a philosopher researching technological change, medical ethics, and ethical frameworks around human enhancement. So what are the core challenges ethically around these issues?
I think one of the main challenges is about what this could do to our society. Because today we already have a situation where you have an elite of people that use all the means possible to entrench their positions in society. They send their kids to elite schools, to elite tutors. They give them super healthy foods and put them in super healthy training camps, so to speak. If we would have a medicine that could, for example, enhance cognitive abilities, as might be possible in the future, then I think we have a real challenge to how we can deal with the possible inequities that could be a result.
And Mats, your main work is with products that help people with decreased physical abilities. You have, for example, helped to develop a glove that can help people with weak hands get stronger. Traditionally, you don't cut off their hands. They get to keep their own hands. So could you tell us about this?
Yeah, that I feel is probably, which is a very good thing anyway, that if you look in Sweden and in other countries where we don't have any, or at least very few soldiers going to war and so on, it's rather rare to actually lose a body part. But what happens is when you get older, or when you, after certain sicknesses, or just for wearing out during work labor and so on, that you decrease the capacity of, for instance, which I'm most interested in, the hands. So what we have done is to try to see, can we get some rather simple construction that still would help you in your daily life? So this glove that you mentioned is just a glove that you put on, but you wear also a pair of motors, either on your back or on your belt, and you have wires from the motors to the glove, which means that if I, for instance, take this glove on and grab a glass, these wires will be pulled by the motors to give this grip and to be able to keep a firm grip around the glass.
But
and not dropping it.
Feel like a piece of clothing? So it's not like you have an Iron Man arm?
No, it feels like a normal glove. The only thing is that you have a glove that bends without you knowing it, and it makes a certain buzzing noise. So, okay. But it is...
That is quite exciting. But could you use a similar technology in a bodysuit to give a person super strength? I'm sorry, I'm just obsessed
You're
with this
focusing
thing.
on the super strength.
Yes.
Well, theoretically you could, but there are two things too. The motors. You need to have very strong, very powerful motors, and you also need very strong wires. So this kind of equipment to give you super strength would probably need some kind of super strength just to wear it, because it would be very, very bulky, very heavy. And that is not, our aim is not to give super strength, just to give you enough power to actually work, function in the daily life.
But there are some scenarios where it would be desirable. I'm thinking of, I don't know, firemen or certain situations.
Divers and astronauts, for instance, also use this kind of equipment where they're either performing tasks that they require strength, or just that you can do the certain movement for a very long time without dropping it. So maybe you don't need very much strength for each time, but you need to be able to keep that without being weary. Like we humans, we get weary if you lift a very light object and you have to keep it like this for 10 hours, then you will drop it. But if you have an artificial device that helps you keep the arm in this position, then so it's not so fancy as giving super strength, but it's still
But we
necessary.
could do this. This is something we can do now.
Yes.
Gustav, you're a medical doctor and a researcher in cognitive functions like sleep and stress. And you're also interested in how different types of drugs might enhance or affect our mood and cognitive functions. I am familiar, for instance, with caffeine, which is a great contributor to my quality of life. But so is that the kind of thing we're talking about here?
Absolutely. So in my research, I'm often interested in looking at the effects of specific transmitter systems in the brain. And then we can use substances that affect these transmitter systems specifically. For instance, benzodiazepines that bind to the benzodiazepine receptor, and so on. And among the receptor systems in the brain, there are possibilities to affect our cognitive functions naturally. It's quite difficult to enhance cognitive functions generally by actions on a specific transmitter system. The general exception is that we can increase our vigilance. And caffeine, as you mentioned, is probably the most widespread cognitively enhancing substance in our societies today.
When you say vigilance, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that means in this context. Being not sleepy, or just being more paranoid?
No, being less sleepy and more alert, and more able to perform cognitively and as well as socially or professionally. I predict that the Swedish public sector would collapse if the coffee machines were suddenly removed from the offices one morning.
And I would say that we have a sort of moral imperative to keep coffee going. But then there are some questions about introducing these other kinds of substances. What if we become as dependent on them? Maybe this is a very foolish layman's question, but isn't there a trade-off? There tends to be a trade-off. You lose something in your sort of capacity to concentrate when your vigilance goes up and so on.
Caffeine is generally quite safe, and that's why we tolerate that it's being used in such a widespread manner, I suppose. It's very difficult to overdose. You can. It's almost impossible to kill yourself with caffeine, and generally the side effects are such that people simply limit their intake.
Yes, I'm not super worried about caffeine, but these new things that you're working on, many of them are restricted, I would assume, for good cause. Or?
Well, yes. I'm not working specifically on such drugs myself, but I suppose you could think of the broad class of amphetamine-like drugs that have similar effects. I mean, they stimulate people's wakefulness, and it has been possible to show experimentally that if you give perfectly healthy volunteers relatively small doses of amphetamine or similar drugs, they perform better on cognitive tasks, and in particular they're able to sustain a high level of performance for longer. Now, these drugs are of course illegal, and unless they are prescribed by a doctor, that is. But there is a lot of concern about the increased prescriptions of stimulants due to the increased diagnosis of ADHD in Sweden and many other societies.
But again, then it's prescribed as a medicine. So I'm sorry, is the worry that the availability of amphetamines would be other people would be using them healthy people would be using them to amp their ability?
There is a concern about that, and I don't think leakage of prescription medicine is the main cause or main source of amphetamine-like substances when they are used instrumentally like that. Yeah. There is a concern that we are over-medicalizing people by expanding the group that have an ADHD diagnosis.
I have so many questions about this, Karim.
Yeah, because I think this is where the discussion gets an ethical or normative turn. Yeah. Because we might ask ourselves, what is to medicalize a condition, what is normal, and what kinds of conditions should we treat with a drug? And I think that in our societies, we have thought of being sick, being ill, as a category that exists in the world. It's an objective fact whether or not you're sick or not. And we have thought that if you are sick, then you are entitled to treatment of this kind. Now, with the whole debate on ADHD and other conditions, we can see that the distinction between being ill or disabled in this case and not disabled is actually just a social construction. It's just an idea that our society has, a label that it puts on certain people and not others. And what I've argued in my research is that if we look beyond this distinction, which is quite arbitrary, to be frank, we can start asking another question. Not is this person disabled or is this person sick? We can instead ask, will this drug or treatment or intervention help this person in some way? And is this intervention safe in other ways, or is it cost effective, and so on and so forth? And I believe that we don't need to answer the question, do you have ADHD, before we prescribe a certain medication. What we need to know is whether or not it works.
But if we have a medication, and let's assume it's legal, and we can give it to surgeons or pilots or flight controllers or doctoral students who have very weird lab hours, wouldn't we all, I mean, there's a very strong case to say, well, let's do that. Let's give it to all of these people who are doing something good for the world and can do it even better. Or is there a...
I would say that you have to take the medical risks into consideration. Mm-hmm. So what are the side effects? How likely, I mean, and not only the theoretical side effects, but the side effects given how the drug is likely to be used. If you factor them in and you have the conclusion that the effects are the risks are acceptable, I say why not?
How do you feel about this, Mats?
Well, I totally agree with you, because what we can see is that quite a lot of this enhancement, for instance, if you go back to the superhero strength that you were talking about, if you can give it to someone and it works for a while, but then afterwards you get worse than you were before, would you actually accept that? As long as, okay, I feel very good for a certain amount of time, but after that I lose this and I lose even what I had before. So what you're about side effects, and that also goes on with if you can give a person an increased capacity to do something. It doesn't have to be strength, it could be better vision or some other kinds of vision. But it requires that you lose something else.
When we're talking about things like artificial limbs, we are moving now into a time when they are controlled with my mind, so to speak. They're interfacing with our neural system in different ways. And you raised a very interesting possibility when you suggested that maybe I could run faster if I cut off my legs. That there's an ethical boundary there as well. Do you foresee in, let's say, our lifetime that we could be in a position where it would say, well, maybe I'm going to switch my biological legs to better legs, and it would make sense?
No, but I think it's possible if you're, for instance, discussing sports. So, and if you can already see now, whenever everyone has seen, I think there was a picture of him, or maybe on the commercial for these Crosstalks, this South African runner called the Blade Runner, Oscar Pistorius, who has 2 artificial legs, but he still runs so fast that he could be in the relay team in the Olympics for normal athletes. But if you put this kind of legs on Usain Bolt, who is an excellent runner even from the start, would he be even better? Or for an even better example, if you're, for instance, a high jumper, it's quite obvious that you can probably jump higher if you have legs with some kind of springs attached to them that will help you get a better lift off, so to speak.
Yes, but then you'd need to have quite a lot, of those so they can compete. It would be more like Formula One, I guess.
Yeah,
the engineering
exactly.
also competes.
Who has the best prosthesis? He or she will probably win the tournament. Then we have a very special kind of doping instead of taking, which is your expertise, enhancing with using chemicals. You could actually use mechanical doping, and okay, there we have a quite different scene for what we can do.
This is so mind-boggling, but let's bring something potentially even more mind-boggling. We had a guest on Skype, is Zoltan Istvan, hello, writer, philosopher, futurist, and 2016 presidential candidate in the United States for the newly formed Transhumanist Party. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you for having me, I appreciate it.
Zoltan, first, and very briefly, what is your definition of a transhumanist? What does this mean?
Well, the Latin of transhumanism means that essentially it's beyond human. Sorry, I'm having some audio things, so I'm going to actually go. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
Great. I have feedback. But the transhumanism means beyond. I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Just try it this way.
All right.
Transhumanism means beyond human, and essentially it's a social international movement of a group of people, scientists, technologists, and futurists that are trying to enhance the human being by using radical science and radical technology to basically radically improve the human being. And that can be anything from bionic legs to robotic hearts, to any type of kind of stimulants, like you talked about biohacking drugs, where you might enhance your brain. But anyways, it's just a field that's sort of exploding, and it's also, there's a lot of technology that's emerging with the human being right now, and I think it's something that in the next 10 years you're going to see what we might call cyborg, people interconnected with just a lot of machinery and a lot of technology.
Yes. What I'm wondering, why would you need a political party for this? What are the primary goals on your political agenda?
So the primary goals are this. Transhumanism has never had a political component to it, and this is very important because without politics involved in any kind of social movement, you're unable to get much ground, at least when it comes to legal frameworks, to laws, to governments. So we wanted to form a political party that was centering around pushing the bioethical issues of transhumanism. And that's really important because, for example, Hillary Clinton is one of the forerunners, so is Jeb Bush in the American elections, but they're not talking about designer babies, even though the technology for designer babies is essentially here. They're not talking about what are ethics for designing artificial intelligence. They're not talking about the ethics of whether we should start replacing our limbs with robotic limbs. There's a very strong chance that in 10 years we'll be able to eliminate heart disease through robotic hearts. Maybe I'm a little bit optimistic in my timeline, but one thing's for sure, heart disease is the #1 killer around the world and in America as well. And if we spent, a lot of money, we would be able to build better hearts and probably virtually eliminate heart disease. Now, this is a classic kind of transhumanist technology, but unless you have a political party moving these things, unless you have a political party advocating for these things, the broad populace might not see the actual benefits of transhuman technology. And so that's kind of where we come.
Yeah, here's my worry about this. Isn't there a pretty strong bias for technological advance if you are calling yourself the Transhumanist Party? Because if nobody else is debating this, do you have people in your party saying, oh, maybe it's not a good idea, maybe we should have a serious conversation about why designer babies are perhaps a bad idea?
Yes, well, I got to be honest, the Transhumanist Party advocates for a lot of technology and a lot of, some of these radical ideas. But to be honest, we also, I think, want to bring the conversation out there. For example, while we support the development of artificial intelligence, we believe that one day we'll be able to enhance human intelligence by connecting with artificial intelligence. We're by no means pushing, saying this is the way it must be. What we're really trying to do is bring the conversation to the table so that everyone across America and everyone around the world can start debating these issues and not debate these issues after they've arrived. For example, the designer baby thing is basically here. And you don't have major politicians discussing it, and which means you don't have people discussing it. And that, I think, presents a dilemma for society. So while we, of course, have a very pro-scientific attitude, we also probably even more pro of just having a conversation and hoping that people will listen and that together, as a nation and as a world, we can, as a species, we can make the very best decisions and move forward.
Very good. Let's bring in the studio on this. Do you agree that the legal frameworks are not haven't evolved at the pace of the technology?
Absolutely, and neither has the public debate. It's quite uncontroversial that we need to fight against disease and illness. And as Zoltan says, we are virtually at the point now where we can take out genes that carry a risk of disease already before an embryo is formed. We can transfer mitochondria today and save people from having to live with debilitating mitochondrial diseases. There's no reason to suppose that we won't soon be able to change genes in the nucleus of the cell. And then we will face some difficult choices. Of course, we should take out a single polymorphism in a gene. That means that a person has a debilitating disease or they do not. But then perhaps someone wishes to take out 10,000 risk genes for Alzheimer's. What will that do to them, and should we allow it? It's a very reasonable question that we should discuss.
So there are all kinds of worrying conundrums here. One has to do with how do we test for this when we're developing, what is the testing procedure going to be like when the science progresses. The other is the ethical decisions about doing this. And then, of course, as Karim mentioned earlier, also you said we will be able to, or we are able to do these things, but already we can't provide basic healthcare to all of our populations, even in the Nordic countries, which have very strong security systems for everyone. And even so, we can't have fully equal healthcare for all. This would seem to be a problem that would accelerate enormously if we add these types of technologies to Karim.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I also agree that it seems like the public's perception of risk is highly influenced by irrelevant aspects. So we tend to feel that some things are inherently dangerous because we associate them with radiation, with genes, and with big pharma, say. Whereas other things that pose perhaps a much more urgent risk, like contamination of heavy metals in our inland in the seas, and other chemicals in our near environment, these topics are seldom discussed as much. And I think that is very important, that we kind of recalibrate our discussions on risk and technological ethics. But I'm not sure we need a transhumanist party for this. Or I hope that we don't need a transhumanist party for this, because if that's the case, there's not going to be a lot of debate around these topics.
Let's add another voice to this conversation. Also joining us now, I think, is Maria Konovalenko, molecular biophysicist. Do we have Maria here? Who is also a blogger and a speaker on the idea of radical life extension. Welcome to Crosstalks, Maria.
Thanks very much for having me.
Maria, you want to mitigate aging and make humans live longer. Why is this important?
Well, to me, transhumanism means enhancing human capabilities using science and technology. And really, it sets the hierarchy of goals, because what is the main limiting thing for us as humans? In my opinion, it is aging. Aging is the main cause of a whole plethora of different debilitating diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases, neurodegenerative pathologies like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, like diabetes, osteoporosis, arthritis. There's a whole long list of all those terrible things that happen to us when we're getting older. And aging is the core factor that is, it's the main leading cause. And I think that eliminating aging would be would enable us as humans to prevent those diseases from happening. And we, by doing this, we will eliminate a great deal of pain and suffering, and we will push our what is limiting us away. And I think that creating this kind of life extension technologies is really crucial at this point, because we actually have the knowledge. Science actually knows what to do. Well, for example, there's already some 40 FDA-approved drugs that were shown to be really beneficial in terms of life extension in lab animals. But nobody really has tested them or ran any clinical trials to see whether a combination of those drugs would be life-extending in humans. And this is not a very sort of scientifically heavy thing to do. It's just a matter of going ahead and running a trial like this.
Maria,
of course,
can I ask, just you mentioned all of these symptoms of aging and said they would be meaningful to push it away, but would we in fact just push them away? Would we get old later? Is that what we're talking about? We'd still get just as old and just as weak, it would just happen later? Or are we looking at a way of life where we will live longer, healthier, and then sort of die healthy? And then what is it we're dying of then, if we don't age? We'll age eventually still.
For now, yes, I think that's a realistic prediction as of right now, because we don't really have anything more radical to keep us alive and preserve our consciousness for, well, indefinitely, right at this point. But I think I'm very optimistic about, well, I actually think that these technologies will be created eventually. So for now, with the existing medical technologies or what can go into scientific experiments or clinical trials at this point, we can postpone age-related diseases. So it's about living longer, healthier. You're exactly right that it doesn't really make much sense if we extend our healthy lifespan. Then we why would we die healthy? No, obviously, I don't think that would be the case. So basically, we will live longer, healthier, and then I'm really hoping that during that time that we will be able to sort of buy ourselves with the technologies, we will come up with something else, something new that will enable us to push the limits even further.
This is very interesting, and I'm not entirely certain I sympathize with this. I mean, for me personally, this. Well, it's all going to be pop culture references now, but there used to be a hit song once in my youth called Who Wants to Live Forever? And I think the lesson was that you don't actually want to live forever. Zoltan, I would assume that life extension is a key part of the transhumanist agenda, but it would seem that the societal impact would be astonishing. Would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, sure. Ultimately, I agree with Maria that, life extension is the #1 goal of transhumanism. In fact, it's the #1 goal of the Transhumanist Party. We want to allocate as many resources as we can to getting people to live far longer than they're living. When you actually look at what's happening around the world today, you have approximately 150,000 people that die every day on planet Earth. That's a huge loss of both lives, loved ones, productivity from an economic standpoint. We can stop that. We can make it so people can live much longer. We can make it so people can have much, happier lives, be a part of economic prosperity and those kind of things for far longer. We just need to allocate resources to it. And we're not doing it, as a world. The net worth of the planet is around $400 trillion. And I think if we gave $1 trillion to the life extension field, probably within 10 years, we would come up with schemes to keep people living indefinitely. So at least another 10 or 20 years, and then we'd be able to kind of figure out the other pieces.
Let's turn back to the studio. I think, so let's say that we could allocate a little trillion. All of your research would probably benefit enormously from this. All of your laboratories, if we're building cyborgs, to cyborgs that live very long and change societies in fundamental ways, would this be something, is this something that you're working towards, Mats?
I would say that my first priority would not be actually to prolong life, but to make the life work more suitable for the people. You can be in an accident while you're young, or you can even be born with just one arm or just one leg and so on. And I would definitely focus on trying to increase the life quality for people during our normal, you might disagree what is our normal lifespan, but say it's 80, 85 years. And if you can make, I feel fine during all these 85 years, then, I can accept that I will die after that. To prolong the life for so many years, or I don't know how many years you are actually planning to.
Let's ask, Maria, how many years do you think is reasonable to assume that we'll be able to live? If not indefinitely, but for now, let's say people who are born today, how long do you think they would live?
I think, I don't want to, sound very, very speculative here, but I think it's safe to assume that the existing record for life extension would definitely be pushed further. It is now 122 years, and I'm pretty sure that there's a good chance that the average lifespan will be around that age. However, it's really, really hard to predict, because people who were born today, maybe they will have the opportunity to live forever. We just don't know that. I would definitely hope so. However, it depends basically on us whether we will be able to accelerate technological progress and push forward the creation of these kind of technologies, because they're the very best that can happen to us. Right now, aging just takes away so many lives, and it's such a tragedy that the society just, turns a blind eye to.
I'm realizing we should have probably had a theologian or somebody like this, because we have there. I'm just trying to understand what would happen with culture when everything we've created to handle the fact of our mortality would also change. Gustav, what's your medical man's opinion on all of this?
Well, I think the key thing is not to extend life, but to extend healthy life. And this, I think, echoes some of the things that have already been said. And that's why the mainstream effort of medical science goes into preventing and treating diseases rather than fighting aging as such. We don't have we haven't found something like a central clock in the body that determines our age and that we could change. Instead, every body part ages, as it were, independently from the others, and it seems very difficult to counteract aging as such. On the other hand, we've been tremendously successful in working against the big diseases that kill us. Cardiovascular diseases are much, much more manageable today than they have been, and that's probably the leading reason why we live longer. And if we can continue to make incremental improvements with cardiovascular diseases, with cancer and with dementia, then I agree with Maria. It's realistic that we can push the boundaries for healthy living quite far. I wouldn't dare to say a number, but that's where I hope we're heading.
Karim?
Yeah, I'm a philosopher, so I don't have much to add on the scientific part, but I think there's an interesting moral problem, a moral dilemma here, because I think that for us, of course, it would be very nice to live a very long and healthy life. I mean, that's what everyone wants, right? It would be good for me, it would be good for you, it would be good for you. But we have to consider that we live in a planet which has strict boundaries for how many people can exist at any given time. Of course, these boundaries will depend on a number of factors, technology being one. So if we make the very optimistic assumption that some transhumanists do, that in 10 or 20 years we'll have self-replicating solar cells and that all our basic human needs will be taken care of, then of course it's not a big problem. But if we make more realistic assumptions about the limits of our ability to feed a population on Earth, then of course a drastically expanded lifespan would mean that we also expand the population and the population growth accordingly. And Zoltan mentioned that 150,000 people die every day, and 100 of them roughly die from aging or age-related causes. So if you have the current UN projections that sees the global population coming to 11 or 12 billions by 2100, with a cure for aging, you would see a completely different development that would put, I fear, severe stress on the ecosystems of our planet.
I have another connected question to this that I would like to put very briefly both to you, Zoltan and Maria, because I'm worried that there's a sort of utilitarian conflict or some kind of slight dishonesty in this, because it seems quite selfish. Of course, I want for me individually live very long, but if we were to invest a lot of resources in letting privileged people live longer, if we really are out to reduce suffering, maybe preventive measures would make a lot more sense. And if we want to increase cognitive capabilities in the elite, maybe making them work less and be less stressed would actually be a better investment of this money. So, do you see what I mean? Is it really, how much is this a personal journey for immortality, a quest for immortality essentially, and how much is it really saying, well, I mean, for instance, would you be prepared to put your own life down on the line for immortality for others? I'm asking a very big question, I do understand. Zoltan?
Yeah, no, that is a very big question. First off, I don't like to think of transhumanism or life extension science as something that's selfish. I think every entity, any animal out there is looking for survival as perhaps the most quintessential and basic instinct in their lives, and especially looking for the survival of their loved ones. I have 2 kids. Of course, I want my daughters to live indefinitely, as well as my family and wife and stuff. So it's not selfish. I think transhumanism is perhaps the most altruistic philosophy out there, trying to help others to live better and longer. And I think ultimately you can get into a place where you can convince people that they can do this. We can put the science, the money, and the technology into this, and the world can be actually a lot better. What I think a lot of people forget when they deal with transhumanism and life extension science is that by living longer, people actually get wealthier, live better lives, better health. That in turn is going to reduce the population, could be, as most developed countries have a lot less population bases than others.
Yeah.
So that, in effect, will help the world. I think we're going to be much better. I mean, this is the United Nations reports show this, that the more technology we have in our lives, the more science, the more transhumanism in our lives, the better lives get all around the world for both developed and developing countries.
I have to agree that is very exciting. We're getting ready to get for questions from the room. So now I wonder, you can think about this for just a second. I'm just going to ask Maria very briefly to answer this as well. Is it a personal quest, or do you genuinely believe that it is also that everybody will benefit?
Absolutely. Everybody will benefit, and this is actually inevitable. Yes, the first adopters, the first technologies will probably be quite expensive. Well, remember cell phones. In 1996, a cell phone cost a fortune. It was so expensive, and only the wealthiest people could afford them. Now, there are more cell phones than toilets on Earth. Technology tends to become cheaper, and even biotechnologies as well. It costs around $4 billion, well, somewhere in between $3 and $4 billion to sequence the first human genome. And now it's a matter of several thousand. So there's a tremendous trend of the technology is getting cheaper over time. So I would actually love to see the billionaires contribute to creating those technologies, just because those technologies, it is actually impossible for them being just for the rich people.
Thank you.
Because,
It's very, very good. Do we have a question from the room? The room is sitting in shocked silence. Be brave. Be brave. Surely you have something on your mind. Okay. Yes? No? Yeah? I thought somebody was almost brave enough. No. Then I'm just going to ask all of you, it may sound like a trivial question, but I do mean it quite seriously. If you could enhance one ability in yourself, what would you enhance and how? Let's start over here with Gustav. You must have thought of this.
You're asking a working scientist. The hours of the day are too few, and one would always wish to be able to put more effort into gaining knowledge. I mean, doing what I do every day.
So the legal amphetamines is what we're talking about.
Well, let's say the legal, effective, and side effect free amphetamines.
Mats, what about you?
I think I would say because the one of our senses that I feel is the most fantastic one is the vision. And I would actually say, okay, if we have sufficient light, then we can see. But if it's dark or if it's very far away, if you could increase the capacity to see in the dark, to see at a very far distance, to see, for instance, to see other wavelengths, then we can see, so we can see, for instance, you can see the heat sense of seeing that some animals have. So I think it would be very fascinating.
I love that. But what if the trade-off was that you would have to have very large eyes, like in other mammals that see in the dark? Would that still be worth it?
I think I could live with that, yeah.
Interesting. Karim?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this question a lot of times, and almost every time I've answered cognitive enhancement, of course. I mean, I want to be smarter. That would further my career and so on and so forth. But the more I read about cognitive enhancement, the more I realize that it seems like a lot of very smart people are also very crazy. I read somewhere, and this might be true, but it's a fun anecdote, that almost half of the people that are members of Mensa believe in one crazy conspiracy theory. So it seems like there's not a clear correlation between very high intelligence and very high rationality. It seems like up to a certain point, the correlation is not significant. So if there was a drug that could enhance my rationality, I would really like that. But since rationality is not about our physical, brain abilities, but rather a very complex fusion of attitudes and heuristics, mental tools. I don't think that is likely to be possible to enhance.
That's interesting, and we're back to the trade-off again. Maybe the price would be too high. Interesting, thank you. Maria, what would you enhance if you have to pick just one thing?
Stress resistance mechanisms, like DNA repair, autophagy, proteolysis, all those systems that we intrinsically have that help us keep aging in check until a certain point of time when everything falls apart. So I would like to enhance those guys because they will enable me, and not only me, but rather everybody in the world, if we came up with those technologies, how to do that, to be healthier longer.
And maybe happier as well, since there's a
Probably,
mental
yeah.
aspect to the stress resistance, physical stress resistance as well. Yeah, exactly. What about you, Zoltan? What would you pick?
Well, I have heart disease running in my family, so I would replace my heart with a robotic heart, and it's something I absolutely would like to do. And there's so many benefits to that because, for example, a robotic heart will in the future be able to be controlled with your iPhone. So if you want to go surf 100-foot waves, you could speed it up, your heart, so it works better. Or, for example, if you want to have sex, you could speed it up so it works better. Or if you want to meditate or sleep, you could slow it down. These are going to be the benefits of merging machinery into our bodies, especially when it comes to organ replacement, and often it's organ failure that causes death. So ultimately, I would go for the bionic heart and feel like a kind of a superhuman.
We only have very few minutes left, but I would like to add a little bit, or to open a little bit with this question: the bionic man, the cyborgs that we are. And some people argue, of course, that we are already cyborgs, that the technology we are so dependent on makes us essentially that. But how are we on integrating technology into our bodies? Are we at a point when it's going to be completely normalized in our lifetime? Zoltan?
Yes, 100%. I think over the next 10 years, you're going to be amazed at what happens. Recently, an NBC report came out saying that potentially within a decade, 50% of us are going to have, at least in the developing world, will have implants. And this is the kind of technology that's going to change. They already have telepathy that exists between computers and people. And eventually, we're going to be so interconnected that we'll be bouncing off the internet, directly interfacing it with just from thoughts in our mind. These are the kind of things, when you talk about cognitive enhancement, that are going to radically change our perception of reality and radically change what it actually means to be a human being. And I think the younger generation couldn't be more excited for some of these things.
Mats Nilsson, do you agree?
I'm a bit skeptic to some of these things. You're totally right about the implants, of course, that we can replace quite a few body parts, but to connect the brain and to actually get some information directly into the nervous system, I think that's quite very, very far away, if it's even possible at all. But I would actually like to return to what you were talking about, your comic books at the very start, because all these kind of research that we need to do experiments on living creatures. Either you can do it on rats or or eventually on human beings. And the problem is here, or actually not a problem, it's a good thing, that you need a permission, the ethical permission to do that, which means that it takes very, very slow progress. So what we might face is that you have, instead of the super strengths and superheroes, you have the supervillains who build their own labs apart from all the supervision from the authority or from the law and so on. And that, I fear, is a bit risky future as well, to see what can people do who doesn't have the scruples to stop them from increasing this kind of thing.
That's absolutely terrifying, but of course you're entirely right. I think a lot of our audience are grad students, or are picking their research, or sort of selecting the path for their research careers right now. Where would you recommend? What's the most exciting thing right now? I realize we're running out of time, so let's do this quite briefly. What is right now a super interesting frontier in this whole area of enhancing human capabilities? Maybe we should do a quick round. Zoltan, very briefly.
Sure. I'll say that what the gentleman had just said, security, because in the future, if we're all tied into the internet, especially with brain implants and stuff like that, security is going to be the #1 field for anyone to choose a career in. It's going to just be completely booming for the next 50 years.
That's great. Let's do super brief because we're running out of time. Maria, just very briefly, where would you want to go into research right now?
Well, I am a researcher. I'm a PhD student at USC, University of Southern California, in the Buck Institute, and I would definitely recommend either getting in those two or any other kind of aging research laboratory.
Karim?
I would say that what Gustav is doing is probably the most interesting about the brain and how to modulate emotions and cognitive states.
I would have wished that you would have said we need more people working on the ethics of this. But
I would rather obviously say that the connection between the human body and the technology to make it more easy to interact between the, as Zoltan also thinking about, I think that is the most fascinating thing right
bringing
now.
the cyborg on, Gustav.
The human brain is the first and last frontier.
Very good. This has been a super exciting conversation, but we are at the end of the show. Thank you, Karim Jebari, Gustav Nilsson, Mats Nilsson, Zoltan Istvan, and Maria Konovalenko for generously taking this time with us. Crosstalks will be back in a month with more great minds and intelligent discussions. Be sure to check in at crosstalks.tv for updates on topics and guests. And for now, be safe and be brave.